Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. I looked up the name of the doctor from the previous episode, Dr. Rupil, because I thought that's an interesting surname. And I wondered whether it might be Indian, but it turns out it's actually Italian. Either way, bit of insight into the middle classes in Georgian London. Chapter 8. A Remonstrance. Cecilia returned home so late that she was summoned to the dining parlour the moment she entered the house. Her morning dress and her long absence excited much curiosity in Mrs. Harrel, which a quick succession of questions evasively answered soon made general, and Sir Robert Floyer, turning to her with a look of surprise, said, "If you have such freaks as these, Miss Beverley, I must begin to inquire a little more into your proceedings." "That, sir," said Cecilia very coldly, "would ill repay your trouble." "When we get her to Violet Bank," cried Mr. Harrel, "we shall be able to keep a better watch over her." "I hope so," answered Sir Robert, "though, faith, she has been so demure that I never suppose she did anything but read sermons. However, I find there's no going upon trust with women any more than with money." "Ay, Sir Robert," cried Mrs. Harrel, "you know I always advise you not to be so easy, and I am sure I really think you deserve a little severity for not being more afraid."
"Afraid of what, madam?" cried the baronet. "Of a young lady's walking out without me? Do you think I wish to be any restraint upon Miss Beverley's time in the morning, while I have the happiness of waiting upon her every afternoon?"
Cecilia was thunderstruck by this speech, which not only expressed an open avowal of his pretensions, but a confident security of his success. She was shocked that a man of such principles should even for a moment presume upon her favour, and irritated at the stubbornness of Mr. Harrel in not acquainting him with her refusal. His intimation of coming to the house for the happiness of waiting upon her made her determine without losing a moment to seek herself an explanation with him, while the discovery that he was included in the Easter party, which various other concomitant causes had already rendered disagreeable to her, made her look forward to that purposed expedition with nothing but unwillingness and distaste. But though her earnestness to conclude this affair made her now put herself voluntarily in the way of the baronet, she found her plan always counteracted by Mr. Harrel, who, with an officiousness too obvious to pass for chance, constantly stopped the progress of any discourse in which he did not himself bear a part. A more passionate admirer might not have been so easily defeated, but Sir Robert, too proud for solicitation, and too indolent for assiduity, was very soon checked, because very soon wearied. The whole evening, therefore, to her infinite mortification, passed away without affording her any opportunity of making known to him his mistake. Her next effort was to remonstrate with Mr. Harrel himself, but this scheme was not more easy of execution than the other, since Mr. Harrel, suspecting she meant again to dun him for her money, avoided all separate conversation with her so skilfully that she could not find a moment to make him hear her. She then resolved to apply to his lady, but here her success was not better. Mrs. Harrel, dreading another lecture upon economy, peevishly answered to her request of a conference that she was not very well, and could not talk gravely. Cecilia, justly offended with them all, had now no recourse but in Mr. Monckton, whose counsel for effectively dismissing the baronet she determined to solicit by the first opportunity. The moment, therefore, that she next saw him, she acquainted him with the speeches of Sir Robert and the behaviour of Mr. Harrel. There needed no rhetoric to point out to Mr. Monckton the danger of suffering such expectations, or the impropriety of her present situation. He was struck with both in a manner the most forcible, and spared not for warmth of expression to alarm her delicacy, or add to her displeasure. But chiefly he was exasperated against Mr. Harrel, assuring her there could be no doubt but that he had some particular interest in so strenuously and artfully supporting the pretensions of Sir Robert. Cecilia endeavoured to refute this opinion, which she regarded as proceeding rather from prejudice than justice. But when she mentioned that the baronet was invited to spend the Easter holidays at Violet Bank, he represented with such energy the consequent constructions of the world, as well as the unavoidable encouragement such intimacy would imply, that he terrified her into an earnest entreaty to suggest to her some way of deliverance. "There is only one," answered he. "You must peremptorily refuse to go to Violet Bank yourself. If, after what has passed, you are included in the same party with Sir Robert, you give a sanction yourself to the reports already circulated of your engagement with him, and the effect of such a sanction will be more serious than you can easily imagine, since the knowledge that a connection is believed in the world frequently, if not generally, leads by imperceptible degrees to its real ratification." Cecilia, with the utmost alacrity, promised implicitly to follow his advice, whatever might be the opposition of Mr. Harrel. He quitted her, therefore, with unusual satisfaction, happy in his power over her mind, and anticipating with secret rapture the felicity he had in reserve from visiting her during her absence of the family. As no private interview was necessary for making known her intention of giving up the Easter party, which was to take place in 2 days' time, she mentioned the next morning her design of spending the holidays in town, when Mr. Harrel sauntered into the breakfast-room to give some commission to his lady. At first he only laughed at her plan, gaily rallying her upon her love of solitude, but when he found it was serious, he very warmly opposed it, and called upon Mrs. Harrel to join in his expostulations. That lady complied, but in so faint a manner that Cecilia soon saw she did not wish to prevail, and with a concern that cost her infinite pain, now finally perceived that not only all her former affection was subsided into indifference, but that since she had endeavoured to abridge her amusements, she regarded her as a spy, and dreaded her as the censor of her conduct. Meanwhile, Mr. Arnott, who was present, though he interfered not in the debate, waited the event with anxiety, naturally hoping her objections arose from her dislike of Sir Robert, and secretly resolving to be guided himself by her motions. Cecilia, at length, tiring of the importunities of Mr. Harrel, gravely said that if he desired to hear the reasons which obliged her to refuse his request, she was ready to communicate them. Mr. Harrel, after a little hesitation, accompanied her into another room. She then declared her resolution not to live under the same roof with Sir Robert, and very openly expressed her vexation and displeasure that he so evidently persisted in giving that gentleman encouragement. "My dear Miss Beverley," answered he carelessly, "when young ladies will not know their own minds, it is necessary some friend should tell it them. You were certainly very favourable to Sir Robert but a short time ago, and so I dare say you will be again, when you have seen more of him." "You amaze me, sir," cried Cecilia. "When was I favourable to him? Has he not always and regularly been my aversion?" "I fancy," answered Mr. Harrel, laughing, "you will not easily persuade him to think so. Your behaviour at the Opera House was ill calculated to give him that notion." "My behaviour at the Opera House, sir, I have already explained to you, and if Sir Robert himself has any doubts, either from that circumstance or from any other, pardon me if I say they can only be attributed to your unwillingness to remove them. I entreat you, therefore, to trifle with him no longer, nor to subject me again to the freedom of implications extremely disagreeable to me." "Oh, fie, fie, Miss Beverley! After all that has passed, after his long expectations, his constant attendance, you cannot for a moment think seriously of discarding him." Cecilia, equally surprised and provoked by this speech, could not for a moment tell how to answer it, and Mr. Harrel, wilfully misinterpreting her silence, took her hand and said, "Come, I am sure you have too much honour to make a fool of such a man as Sir Robert Floyer. There is not a woman in town who will not envy your choice, and I assure you there is not a man in England I would so soon recommend to you." He would then have hurried her back into the next room, but drawing away her hand with undisguised resentment, "No, sir," she cried, "this must not pass. My positive rejection of Sir Robert the instant you communicated to me his proposals, you can neither have forgotten nor mistaken, and you must not wonder if I acknowledge myself extremely disobliged by your unaccountable perseverance in refusing to receive my answer." "Young ladies who have been brought up in the country," returned Mr. Harrel with his usual negligence, "are always so high-flowered in their notions, it is difficult to deal with them. But as I am much better acquainted with the world than you can be, you must give me leave to tell you, that if, after all, you refuse Sir Robert, he'll be using him very ill." "Why will you say so, sir?" cried Cecilia, "when it is utterly impossible you can have formed so preposterous an opinion? Pray hear me, however, finally, and pray tell Sir Robert—" "No, no," interrupted he, with affected gaiety, "you shall manage it all your own way. I will have nothing to do with the quarrels of lovers." And then, with a pretended laugh, he hastily left her. Cecilia was so much incensed by this impracticable behaviour, that instead of returning to the family, she went directly to her own room. It was easy for her to see that Mr. Harrel was bent upon using every method he could devise to entangle her into some engagement with Sir Robert, and though she could not imagine the meaning of such a scheme, the littleness of his behaviour excited her contempt, and the long-continued error of the baronet gave her the utmost uneasiness. She again determined to seek an explanation with him herself, and immovably to refuse joining the party to Violet Bank. The following day, while the ladies and Mr. Arnott were at breakfast, Mr. Harrel came into the room to inquire if they should all be ready to set off for his villa by 10 o'clock the next day. Mrs. Harrel and her brother answered in the affirmative, but Cecilia was silent, and he turned to her and repeated his question. "Do you think me so capricious, sir," said she, "that after telling you but yesterday I could not be of your party, I shall tell you today that I can?" "Why, do you not really mean to remain in town by yourself?" answered he. "You cannot suppose that will be an eligible plan for a young lady. On the contrary, it will be so very improper, that I think myself, as your guardian, obliged to oppose it." Amazed at this authoritative speech, Cecilia looked at him with a mixture of mortification and anger, but knowing it would be vain to resist this power if he was too resolute to exert it, she made not any answer. "Besides," he continued, "I have a plan for some alterations in the house during my absence, and I think your room in particular will be much improved by them, but it will be impossible to employ any workmen if we do not all quit the premises." This determined persecution now seriously alarmed her. She saw that Mr. Harrel would omit no expedient or stratagem to encourage the addresses of Sir Robert, and force her into his presence, and she began to apprehend that her connivance in his conduct might be presumed upon by that gentleman. She resolved, therefore, as the last and only effort in her power for avoiding him, to endeavour to find an accommodation at the house of Mrs. Delvile during the excursion to Violet Bank, and if, when she returned to Portman Square, the baronet still persevered in his attendance, to entreat her friend Mr. Monckton would take upon himself the charge of undeceiving him. The net grows ever closer. It makes me so mad that all these novels of this period should consist of women rejecting men and men not accepting it and saying they don't know their own minds. It is just so infuriating. Oh! Onwards. Chapter 9. A Victory. As not a moment was now to be lost, Cecilia had no sooner suggested this scheme than she hastened to St. James's Square to try its practicability. She found Mrs. Delvile alone and still at breakfast. After the first compliments were over, while she was considering in what manner to introduce her proposal, Mrs. Delvile herself led to the subject by saying, "I am very sorry to hear that we are so soon to lose you, but I hope Mr. Harrel does not intend to make any long stay at his villa, for if he does I shall be half tempted to come and run away with you from him." "And that," said Cecilia, delighted with this opening, "would be an honour I am more than half tempted to desire." "Why, indeed, your leaving London at this time," continued Mrs. Delvile, "is for me particularly unfortunate, as if I could now be favoured with your visits, I should doubly value them, for Mr. Delvile is gone to spend the holidays at the Duke of Derwent's, whither I was not well enough to accompany him. My son has his own engagements, and there are so few people I can bear to see, that I shall live almost entirely alone." "If I," cried Cecilia, "in such a situation might hope to be admitted, how gladly for that happiness would I exchange my expedition to Violet Bank." "You are very good and very amiable," said Mrs. Delvile, "and your society would indeed give me infinite satisfaction. Yet I am no enemy to solitude. On the contrary, company is commonly burdensome to me. I find few who have any power to give me entertainment, and even of those few, the chief part have in their manners, situation, or characters, an unfortunate something that generally renders a near connection with them inconvenient or disagreeable. There are, indeed, so many drawbacks to regard and intimacy, from pride, from propriety, and various other collateral causes, that rarely as we meet with people of brilliant parts, there is almost ever some objection to our desire of meeting them again. Yet to live wholly alone is cheerless and depressing, and with you at least," taking Cecilia's hand, "I find not one single obstacle to oppose 1,000 inducements, which invite me to form a friendship that I can only hope may be as lasting as I am sure it will be pleasant." Cecilia expressed her sense of this partiality in the warmest terms, and Mrs. Delvile, soon discovering by her manner that she took not any delight in her intended visit to Violet Bank, began next to question her whether it would be possible for her to give it up. She instantly answered in the affirmative. "And would you really be so obliging?" cried Mrs Delvile with some surprise, as to bestow upon me the time you had destined for this gay excursion? Most willingly, answered Cecilia, if you are so good as to wish it. But can you also, for you must by no means remain alone in Portman Square, manage to live entirely in my house till Mr Harrel's return? To this proposal, which was what she most desired, Cecilia gave a glad assent, and Mrs Delvile, extremely pleased with her compliance, promised to have an apartment prepared for her immediately. She then hastened home to announce her new plan. This she took occasion to do when the family was assembled at dinner. The surprise with which she was heard was very general. Sir Robert seemed at a loss what conclusion to draw from her information. Mr Arnott was half elated with pleasure, and half depressed with apprehension. Mrs Harrel wondered without any other sensation, and Mr Harrel himself was evidently the most concerned of the party. Every effort of persuasion and importunity he now essayed to prevail upon her to give up this scheme, and still accompany them to the villa, but she coolly answered that her engagement with Mrs Delvile was decided, and she had appointed to wait upon her the next morning. When her resolution was found so steady, a general ill humour took place of surprise. Sir Robert now had the air of a man who thought himself affronted. Mr Arnott was wretched from 1,000 uncertainties. Mrs Harrel, indeed, was still the most indifferent, but Mr Harrel could hardly repress his disappointment and anger. Cecilia, however, was all gaiety and pleasure. In removing only from the house of one guardian to another, she knew she could not be opposed, and the flattering readiness with which Mrs Delvile had anticipated her request, without inquiring into her motives, had relieved her from a situation which now grew extremely distressing, without giving to her the pain of making complaints of Mr Harrel. The absence of Mr Delvile contributed to her happiness, and she much rejoiced in having now the prospect of a speedy opportunity to explain to his son whatever had appeared mysterious in her conduct respecting Mr Belfield. If she had anything to regret, it was merely the impossibility at this time of waiting for the counsel of Mr Monckton. The next morning, while the family was in the midst of preparation for departure, she took leave of Mrs Harrel, who faintly lamented the loss of her company, and then hastily made her compliments to Mr Harrel and Mr Arnott, and putting herself into a chair, was conveyed to her new habitation. Mrs Delvile received her with the most distinguished politeness. She conducted her to the apartment which had been prepared for her, led her to the library, which she desired her to make use of as her own, and gave her the most obliging charges to remember that she was in a house of which she had the command. Young Delvile did not make his appearance till dinner time. Cecilia, from recollecting the strange situations in which she had lately been seen by him, blushed extremely when she first met his eyes, but finding him gay and easy, general in his conversation, and undesigning in his looks, she soon recovered from her embarrassment, and passed the rest of the day without restraint or uneasiness. Every hour she spent with Mrs Delvile contributed to raise in her esteem the mind and understanding of that lady. She found, indeed, that it was not for nothing she was accused of pride, but she found at the same time so many excellent qualities, so much true dignity of mind, and so noble a spirit of liberality, that however great was the respect she seemed to demand, it was always inferior to what she felt inclined to pay. Nor was young Delvile less rapid in the progress he made in her favour. His character, upon every opportunity of showing it, rose in her opinion, and his disposition and manners had a mingled sweetness and vivacity that rendered his society attractive and his conversation spirited. Here, therefore, Cecilia experienced that happiness she so long had coveted in vain. Her life was neither public nor private, her amusements were neither dissipated nor retired. The company she saw were either people of high rank or strong parts, and their visits were neither frequent nor long. The situation she quitted gave a zest to that into which she entered, for she was now no longer shocked by extravagance or levity, no longer tormented with addresses which disgusted her, nor mortified by the ingratitude of the friend she had endeavoured to serve. All was smooth and serene, yet lively and interesting. "It won't last." Her plan, however, of clearing to young Delvile his mistakes concerning Belfield, she could not put into execution, for he now never led to the subject, though he was frequently alone with her, nor seemed at all desirous to renew his former raillery or repeat his inquiries. She wondered at this change in him, but chose rather to wait the revival of his own curiosity than to distress or perplex herself by contriving methods of explanation. Situated thus happily, she had now one only anxiety, which was to know whether and in what manner Mr. Belfield had received his surgeon, as well as the actual state of his own and his sister's affairs. But the fear of again encountering young Delvile in suspicious circumstances deterred her at present from going to their house. Yet her natural benevolence, which partial convenience never lulled to sleep, impressed her with an apprehension that her services might be wanted. She was induced to write to Miss Belfield, though she forbore to visit her. Her letter was short, but kind and to the purpose. She apologized for her officiousness, desired to know if her brother was better, and entreated her in terms the most delicate to acquaint her if yet she would accept from her any assistance. She sent this letter by her servant, who, after waiting a considerable time, brought her the following answer. To Miss Beverley. Ah, madam, your goodness quite melts me. We want nothing, however. Yet, though I fear we shall not stay so much longer, but though I hope I shall never forget myself so as to be proud and impertinent, I will rather struggle with any hardship than beg, for I will not disoblige my poor brother by any fault that I can help, especially now he has fallen so low. But thank heaven his wound has at last been dressed, for the surgeon has found him out, and he attends him for nothing, though my brother is willing to part with everything he is worth in the world rather than owe that obligation to him. Yet I often wonder why he hates so to be obliged, for when he was rich himself he was always doing something to oblige other people. But I fear the surgeon thinks him very bad, for he won't speak to us when we follow him downstairs. I am sadly ashamed to send this bad writing, but I dare not ask my brother for any help, because he would only be so angry that I wrote anything about him at all. But indeed I have seen too little good come of pride to think of imitating it, and as I have not his genius, I am sure there is no need I should have his defects. Ill, therefore, as I write, you, madam, who have so much goodness and gentleness, would forgive it, I believe, if it was worse almost. And though we are not in need of your kind offers, it is a great comfort to me to think that there is a lady in the world that, if we come to be quite destitute, and if the proud heart of my poor unhappy brother should be quite broken down, will look upon our distress with pity, and generously help us from quite sinking under it. I remain, madam, with the most humble respect, your ever most obliged, humble servant, Henrietta Belfield. Cecilia, much moved by the simplicity of this letter, determined that her very first visit from Portman Square should be to its fair and innocent writer. And having now an assurance that she was in no immediate distress, and that her brother was actually under Mr. Rupil's care, she dismissed from her mind the only subject of uneasiness that at present had endeavoured to disturb it, and gave herself wholly up to the delightful serenity of unallayed happiness. Few are the days of felicity unmixed which we acknowledge while we experience, though many are those we deplore when by sorrow taught their value, and by misfortune their loss. Time with Cecilia now glided on with such rapidity, that before she thought the morning half over, the evening was closed, and ere she was sensible the first week was past, the second was departed for ever. More and more pleased with the inmates of her new habitation, she found in the abilities of Mrs. Delvile sources inexhaustible of entertainment, and in the disposition and sentiments of her son something so concordant to her own, that almost every word he spoke showed the sympathy of their minds, and almost every look which caught her eyes was a reciprocation of intelligence. Her heart, deeply wounded of late by unexpected indifference and undeserved mortification, was now perhaps more than usually susceptible of those penetrating and exquisite pleasures which friendship and kindness possess the highest powers of bestowing. Easy, gay, and airy, she only rose to happiness, and only retired to rest, and not merely heightened was her present enjoyment by her past disappointment, but carrying her retrospection to her earliest memories, she still found her actual situation more peculiarly adapted to her taste and temper than any she had hitherto at any time experienced. The very morning that the destined fortnight was elapsed, she received a note from Mrs. Harrel, with information of her arrival in town, and an entreaty she would return to Portman Square. Cecilia, who thus happy had forgot to mark the progress of time, was now all amazement to find the term of her absence so soon past. She thought of going back with the utmost reluctance, and of quitting her new abode with the most lively regret. The representations of Mr. Monckton daily lost their force, and notwithstanding her dislike of Mr. Delvile, she had no wish so earnest as that of being settled in his family for the rest of her minority. To effect this was her next thought, yet she knew not how to make the proposal, but from the uncommon partiality of Mrs. Delvile, she hoped with a very little encouragement she would lead to it herself. Here, however, she was disappointed. Mrs. Delvile, when she heard of the summons from the Harrels, expressed her sorrow at losing her in terms of the most flattering regret, yet seemed to think the parting indispensable, and dropped not the most distant hint of attempting to prevent it. Cecilia, vexed and disconcerted, then made arrangements for her departure, which she fixed for the next morning. The rest of this day, unlike every other which for the last fortnight had preceded it, was passed with very little appearance, and no reality of satisfaction. Mrs. Delvile was evidently concerned, her son openly avowed his chagrin, and Cecilia felt the utmost mortification. Yet though every one was discontented, no effort was made towards obtaining any delay. The next morning during breakfast, Mrs. Delvile very elegantly thanked her for granting to her so much of her time, and earnestly begged to see her in future whenever she could be spared from her other friends, protesting she was now so much accustomed to her society that she should require both long and frequent visits to soften the separation. This request was very eagerly seconded by young Delvile, who warmly spoke his satisfaction that his mother had found so charming a friend, and unaffectedly joined in her entreaties that the intimacy might be still more closely cemented. Cecilia had no great difficulty in according her compliance to these demands, of which the kindness and cordiality somewhat lessened her disturbance at the parting. When Mrs. Harrel's carriage arrived, Mrs. Delvile took a most affectionate leave of her, and her son attended her to the coach. In her way downstairs, he stopped her for a few moments, and in some confusion said, "I wish much to apologize to Miss Beverley, before her departure, for the very gross mistake of which I have been guilty. I know not if it is possible she can pardon me, and I hardly know myself by what perversity and blindness I persisted so long in my error." "Oh!" cried Cecilia, much rejoiced at this voluntary explanation, "if you are but convinced you are really in an error, I have nothing more to wish. Appearances, indeed, were so strangely against me, that I ought not perhaps to wonder they deceived you." "This is being candid indeed," answered he, again leading her on, "and in truth, though your anxiety was obvious, its cause was obscure, and where anything is left to conjecture, opinion interferes, and the judgment is easily warped. My own partiality, however, for Mr. Belfield, will I hope please my excuse, as from that, and not from any prejudice against the Baronet, my mistake arose. On the contrary, so highly I respect your taste and your discernment, that your approbation, when known, can scarcely fail of securing mine." Great as was the astonishment of Cecilia at the conclusion of this speech, she was at the coach door before she could make any answer, but Delvile, perceiving her surprise, added, while he handed her in, Is it possible? But no, it is not possible I should be again mistaken. I forbore to speak at all, till I had information by which I could not be misled." "I know not in what unaccountable obscurity," cried Cecilia, "I or my affairs may be involved, but I perceive the cloud which I had hoped was dissipated is thicker and more impenetrable than ever." Delvile then bowed to her with a look that accused her of insincerity, and the carriage drove away. Teased by these eternal mistakes, and provoked to find that though the object of her supposed partiality was so frequently changed, the notion of her positive engagement with one of the duellists was invariable, she resolved with all the speed in her power to commission Mr. Monckton to wait upon Sir Robert Floyer, and in her own name give a formal rejection to his proposals, and desire him thenceforward to make known by every opportunity their total independence of each other. For, sick of debating with Mr. Harrel, and detesting all intercourse with Sir Robert, she now dropped her design of seeking an explanation herself. She was received by Mrs. Harrel with the same coldness with which she had parted from her. This lady now appeared to have some uneasiness upon her mind, and Cecilia endeavoured to draw from her its cause, but far from seeking any alleviation in friendship, she studiously avoided her, seeming pained by her conversation, and reproached by her sight. Cecilia perceived this increasing reserve with much concern, but with more indignation, conscious that her good offices had merited a better reception, and angry to find that her advice had not merely failed of success, but even exposed her to aversion. Mr. Harrel, on the contrary, behaved to her with unusual civility, seemed eager to oblige her, and desirous to render his house more agreeable to her than ever. But in this he did not prosper, for Cecilia, immediately upon her return, looking in her apartment for the projected alterations, and finding none had been made, was so disgusted by such a detection of duplicity, that he sunk yet lower than before in her opinion, and she repined at the necessity she was under of any longer continuing his guest. The joy of Mr. Arnott at again seeing her was visible and sincere, and not a little was it increased by finding that Cecilia, who sought not more to avoid Mr. Harrel and Sir Robert than she was herself avoided by Mrs. Harrel, talked with pleasure to nobody else in the house, and scarcely attempted to conceal that he was the only one of the family who possessed any portion of her esteem. Even Sir Robert appeared now to have formed a design of paying her rather more respect than he had hitherto thought necessary, but the violence he did himself was so evident, and his imperious nature seemed so repugnant to the task, that his insolence, breaking forth by starts and checked only by compulsion, was but the more conspicuous from his inadequate efforts to disguise it. And there we shall pause. Have a lovely evening.